Ladies and gentlemen, moving swiftly on, thank you, Gerard. With freedom of movement looking more like a faded orange-coloured line rather than the red line we all were hoping for, immigration is at the front of many people's minds, certainly is mine. And here to talk to us more about immigration is our immigration spokesman, John Bickley.
How are you doing? Good afternoon.
Can I relieve you of that?
No, hold on. Now, watch out for this flag of surrender, or should it be a flag of shame at next week's Tory party conference? It should be waved by every Tory cabinet member. Traitors. Of course, they'll wrap themselves in the Union Jack, which, frankly, the Tories are no longer fit to represent. Last week, we witnessed a weak Prime Minister leading a weak Tory government, leading a weak Tory party, appeasing themselves to their masters in Brussels. Apparently, the UK is leaving the EU in March 2019. However, we know that's a sleight of hand. And as Gerard has said, we're going to have to wait for at least another 2 years, which in political terms means they're trying to kick this into the long grass, before the UK might take back control of its borders and its laws. Does anyone smell a rat? Yes. Sorry? Yes. Well, you can bet your house that come the next general election in 2022, Lib Lab Con will tell the voters that we have left the EU. And therefore they have respected the referendum result. However, it's a safe bet they'll keep us shackled to the EU and its key institutions, which will mean our country will not have left the EU, an affront to the referendum result. Now, based on Mrs May's Florence speech, what's the incentive for the EU to do an agreement with us, a trade agreement, when they can drag out the transitional phase ad infinitum, keeping us a hostage in the EU? Frankly, it's embarrassing to see the UK government acting as supplicants, genuflecting to a foreign power as inept and corrupt as the EU. Mrs May and her Remain colleagues must be suffering Stockholm syndrome. It's becoming blindingly clear that the UK government couldn't negotiate its way out of a paper bag. So it's a matter of great urgency that the Remain-led cabinet is swept aside and replaced with ministers who both believe in Brexit and have the ability to deliver it. Nothing less will be acceptable to the British people. Now let's discuss immigration. I'll press the button, by the way. Okay. The story of immigration is actually quite a recent one in terms of mass immigration. And I thought you'd find it interesting if we look at what's happened to net immigration per Parliament since voting to remain in the EEC in 1975. In the last 4 years of the Wilson-Callaghan government, from 75 to 79, net immigration was actually negative. It was minus 100,000 people over that period. No doubt those Brits that could escape the disastrous tenure of the Labour government emigrated. And no one in their right mind wanted to come here and work hard just to have the Labour government confiscate all their money. Then if you move along to 1980 to 96, over the course of the Thatcher Major governments, net immigration totaled over the whole of that period 258,000, which included the boom years following Thatcher's reforms, when we didn't need mass immigration to become one of the world's top-performing economies. From today's perspective, net immigration during that Tory period of government was so small, on a national level at least, immigration wasn't an issue. And then, of course, we come to the glorious reigns of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. When net immigration went off the scale, it totaled well over 2 million during their 13 years in power. We know the Labour Party encouraged mass immigration. They wanted to change the cultural face of this country and wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity. Labour knows that most ethnic groups tend to vote Labour, and so they deliberately encouraged mass immigration from countries that would give them an electoral advantage. They even sent out search parties. Such was their zeal to rig the electoral system in their favour. And let's not even mention postal voting. What is unforgivable is that Labour didn't care less about the impact of mass immigration on their core working class vote. Labour assumed that they had nowhere else to go. Well, that's until we came along and stood up for the decent, patriotic working class people of this country, who frankly have had enough of being betrayed by the Labour Party and its love of minorities, multiculturalism, uncontrolled immigration, which has resulted for many working class people in their jobs, wages, access to public housing, social services being massively compromised. I mean, it's a disgrace. Now, does anyone believe that the likes of Corbyn, Abbott, Lammy and Thornbury represent the working class? Or even likes them? And then finally on this graph we come to the Tory government that came to power in 2010. Far from getting to grips with immigration, they continue with Labour's disaster. And 1.8 million net immigrants came here after 2010. That's about 2 Birminghams. So much for the Tories' promise that they would bring net immigration down to the tens of thousands. When you look at the Tories' appalling record in immigration, that promise from 2 Tory Prime Ministers has to be the most hollow and misleading one I've heard for some time, other than Mrs May's claim that Brexit means Brexit. Oh, here we go. Now, this shows you what happened in each parliament in terms of average net immigration per year during the course of those parliaments. And it basically tells us is that the Tories' record is appalling. Over the course of the Cameron and May government, net immigration averaged 250,000 a year, massively in advance of what Labour did during their years in power. So much for their promise that they'll bring net immigration down to the tens of thousands. When you look at their appalling record on immigration, we just can't believe that they're going to deliver what we need after Brexit. And finally, on this graph, it actually shows the movement of citizens, Brits, EU citizens and non-EU citizens since 1997. And it shows you just how cataclysmically the Labour and Tory governments have failed to control the one area of immigration we're supposed to have control of, non-EU immigration. In the last 20 years, net immigration from the EU has been 1.5 million. Interestingly, 1.3 million Brits more have left this country than come back. But the elephant in the room is non-EU immigration, which at 3.8 million is 2.5 times that of net immigration from the EU. So much for controlling immigration. Our population is now growing at 400% per decade more than it was in the 70s. At current levels of net immigration, the population, which was 65 million in 2015, is estimated to reach 80 million by 2046. That would be an increase of 24 million people since 1980, about 24 Birminghams. Think about the impact that has on our country, our services, and with cheap immigration wages. And of course, on top of that, we have no idea whether there's 1 million or 2 million, maybe even 3 million illegal immigrants here in the UK. Yes. We don't know. The government doesn't know. But don't worry. According to the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Tories and their left-wing cronies in the media, immigration doesn't have any impact on public services, jobs, wages, housing shortages, or social cohesion. No, it doesn't, according to them. In fact, they think you're a racist if you have the audacity to point out the blinding obvious. The political elite think mass immigration is fantastic. Well, maybe it is if you're looking for low-cost labour or a part of the Islington set needing cheap nannies, plumbers and decorators. The government's supposed to be able to control non-EU immigration, so why have they failed to bring that part of immigration down to the tens of thousands? To show the voters they mean business. Were the Tory party misleading voters? Surely not. And if not, why have they been so incompetent in delivering on their tens of thousands policy? Remember, 2 prime ministers have promised this. So based on their abject failure to control immigration, why should anyone believe that the Tories will deliver absolute control of immigration and our borders following Brexit? Well, frankly, they shouldn't. The government's Brexit white paper is very woolly on when we will take back control. It waffles on about transitional arrangements and agreeing a deal with the EU. Well, based on the Tories' past performance on controlling immigration, it will come as no surprise to anyone in this hall if we see no absolute control of immigration until the mid-20s, and frankly, under Lib Lab Con, not at all. So we have to hold the government's feet to the fire. And that means forcing them to explain in graphic detail how they will deliver the systems and the infrastructure needed for the UK to be 100% in control of immigration and its borders. Now, fortunately, one of our members, Henry Bolton, is a specialist in this area. He was head of border security programmes for the 57 nations of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He has led work on reforming borders across the Balkans, Central Asia and North Africa. And more recently, he was a chief planner for the EU's Common Security and Defence Policy. And in 2013, he was awarded an OBE for services to international security. So I'm just going to invite Henry up for a few minutes before I come back and finish off my speech, just so he can tell you what we need to see this government do if they're telling us the truth about controlling immigration on our borders. Henry.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all. 14 months ago, you, I, and about 17.4 million other people voted to leave the European Union. And in large part, that was because we want to take back control of our borders. Because I wasn't asked to do it. Borders are about a nation. Borders define the extent of sovereign authority, law, and the jurisdiction of our parliament. Borders, by their very definition, shape a nation. They define its people, it defines their character. Borders define what a nation is. Now, properly managed, borders protect a country from the economic, military, criminal, health, and cultural harm that can emanate from outside. They enable the collection of state revenues and facilitate international trade, commerce, and social interaction. Now, conference, my point is this, that without a shadow of a doubt, the attention that a government gives to managing its nation's borders is a certain indicator of its real interest in securing its nation's sovereignty, interests, security, and welfare. So the question we have surely to pose is the Conservative government seriously engaging on this, or is it not? Well, in my view, it is unambiguously not. If, as I and other speakers have already mentioned this, as we believe is likely, that we leave the European Union with no agreement, much of the burden will fall on our borders, and in particularly on the United Kingdom Border Force. Our border force will literally be on the front line of protecting this nation, of facilitating its trade and controlling immigration. Now, the Conservative government between 2012 and by the time we get to April 2018 will have cut the border force by around 30%. And the UK has no cross-government strategy for managing our borders, no framework to inform the decisions and staffing levels, facilities, procurement, or anything else for that matter. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Conservative government will be continuing to neglect our sovereignty interests, and as long as it continues to fail on at least 5 things, it is absolutely not standing up for our interests. So I hope Theresa May has got her pen and notebook handy, because I'm going to give her a couple of tips. 1, immediately reverse the cuts to border force and provide permanent cover at our small ports and harbours. Now. Immediately commence the procurement of a fleet of coastal and fishery patrol vessels and aircraft. Three, conduct a comprehensive risk assessment for all our land, air and sea borders. 4, based on that assessment, immediately develop and implement and fully resource a comprehensive national strategy to drive all efforts of all agencies working on our borders to one agreed set of goals to secure our nation's borders. And fifthly and finally, immediately begin the process of the UK's withdrawal from the Dublin III Agreement, which in practice prevents us from returning third country citizens who have illegally crossed our borders from the EU back to the EU. When and if, and I doubt that they ever will, the Conservative government engage on those 5 issues, I will start to think that they might be serious. As yet, no effective planning or preparation has been made by the Conservative government for managing our borders. The risk of Brexit, ladies and gentlemen, is not in leaving the European Union. It is having a government that is failing to plan and prepare for that moment. The risk is in trusting Brexit to a Conservative government that clearly doesn't have the leadership, the unity, or the knowledge to plan and prepare in any meaningful way. Sooner than spend money on our borders, they would spend it on the vanity project that is HS2. The government has wasted 14 months. And I can only conclude that in defiance of the democratic will of the people of this nation, they have either no intention of taking us out of the European Union in any meaningful way, or that they are simply too incompetent or negligent to care or do so. Whichever is the case, the Conservative government are unfit to govern and cannot be entrusted with taking us out of the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, conference, we in this party are committed to the security and integrity of this nation's borders. It is a priority. It is our nation. Thank you.
Well, there you go. Henry's made it clear that there are a certain number of things this government needs to do, and if they ain't doing it, they're lying to us.
But what are we going to do about it?
Hold on. We're constantly told that without immigration, the British economy would collapse, that the NHS relies on foreign doctors and nurses, and that big business needs access to foreign labour. Well, there's no doubt that immigration is good for our economy. However, it has to be controlled so that it benefits everyone, not just big business and government agencies that have failed to plan ahead for population growth and ensure we train enough doctors, nurses and teachers and ensure our infrastructure and public services are future-proofed. I think it's morally reprehensible that as one of the richest nations in the world, we've had to steal doctors and nurses from much poorer countries than ours because successive governments have been so incompetent in forward planning, training and immigration control. There's 1.5 million Brits unemployed. There's 1.9 million Brits in higher education, many staying out of the workplace till the age of 21 or older, with large numbers of them incurring debts of over £50,000. Many would say that the Labour Party encouraged people into higher education in order to get the employment figures down. Surely not. And Labour and the Tories keep stating that young people who go to university will earn more. However, the ONS estimated in 2015 that 46% of graduates are not doing graduate jobs. So much for staying out of the workplace for up to 5 years after leaving school and incurring 50 grand's worth of debt. Higher education and student debt is the next big mis-selling scandal. Now, the other elephant in the room for our country, which we're going to have to face up to, is our productivity is appalling. It's 19% below the G7 average. It's 35% behind Germany and the USA. So before we keep falling for the mantra that we have to keep the borders open, we need a competent government that will carry out the following reforms. Overhaul our secondary education system so that hundreds of thousands of our young people can leave school at 16 to 18 with world-class academic and vocational qualifications and start earning good money and learning workplace skills rather than staying out of the workplace till their early 20s and racking up massive debts that stifle their ability to set up home and start a family. Stop running a benefit system that pays people to either not work or work minimum hours. Make the UK the most business-friendly place on the planet so that entrepreneurs and international businesses want to set up here but pay their fair share of tax. Make sure businesses are incentivised in investing in training British workers and set 5- and 10-year goals to bring UK productivity up to those levels in Germany and the USA. Now, in 2017, our manifesto set out a plan to achieve net zero migration over a 5-year period. That's eminently achievable if we carry out the sorts of reforms I've just outlined, as we'll generate more wealth from higher output per capita rather than relying on cheap labour that makes many Brits poorer. However, we can't achieve this whilst we're in the sclerotic and corporatist EU, whose share of world trade is diminishing by the decade. A politically brave, visionary and competent government would sever the ties in 2019 and get this country back on track. And finally, let me say this about UKIP. We're not anti-British, or like the Labour Party and the SNP, we're not anti-English. We're not anti-Christian. We're not anti-Jewish, anti-Hindu, or anti-Islam. We're not anti-gay. We're not anti-ethnic diversity or anti-immigration. What we are, though, is pro-British, pro-democracy, pro-one law for all, and equality for all under one law. We're pro-proportional representation, so that all votes matters, and pro this country once again making its own laws, trade deals and controlling its borders and being proud of its history, values and culture. If you want to come here and we need your skills, we won't discriminate against you based on your skin colour, ethnicity, sexual orientation or creed. However, if you don't want to integrate, abide by our laws, respect our values and way of life, and you try to change or undermine them, then you are most certainly not welcome. And if you're already here, please leave. That also applies to those Brits who seem to hate and want to damage their own country. We wish you well by going to live in another country that better suits your beliefs and values. The UK used to be a beacon of democracy, freedom, fairness, shared values, patriotism and an opportunity for all. Once we're free of the EU and rid of our duplicitous political class and their cronies in the media, it can be again. UKIP is needed more than ever, and will have to take on the vested interests that have done so much damage to our country. And like our parents, grand and great-grandparents, take the fight to the enemy and win. Thank you, conference. Thank you.